I should have realized something was wrong the minute I stepped onto the farm. After all, it wasn't my first visit. But this time there was a tension in the air, a gravity that seemed unusual. As soon as I arrived, I saw it in my nephew's eyes. We had always been close, almost like siblings, despite our age difference. But this time, his stare lingered for too long. His grin looked too knowing. It all began innocently enough, I thought. So I came to the farm for a few weeks to assist with chores and, honestly, to get away from the city hubbub. Life had become too frantic, and this location had always been my haven, with its sweeping fields, distant animal noises, and simplicity. It was here that I found tranquility, but I didn't find serenity this time. Something seemed odd from the minute I got off the bus and saw my nephew waiting for me. He was taller and thicker now, but it wasn't only his physical appearance that impressed me. He gazed at me as if he were seeing me for the first time, as if I had changed, or maybe he had changed. The journey to the farmhouse was generally silent, with the exception of a few remarks on how much the area had grown since my previous visit. My nephew kept sneaking looks at me, his hands holding the wheel just too tightly. I attributed it up to enthusiasm. He'd always been overjoyed when I arrived, but deep down I sensed the first shiver of apprehension. When we arrived, the farmhouse looked the same as usual, rustic, comfy, and tucked in the midst of nowhere. My brother and his wife had gone out of town for a few weeks, leaving my nephew to handle the property, so there was just the two of us. I didn't think twice about it. After all, what could possibly go wrong on a farm with just the two of us? The first several days were unremarkable. We spent our mornings caring to the animals, repairing up pieces of the barn, and ensuring that the crops were growing properly. We'd sit on the porch at night, looking up at the stars and chatting about anything and everything. But it was during those quiet times that I noticed something troubling about the way my nephew talked to me. His voice had a particular edge to it, a confidence that had not been there before. One night, when we were sitting on the porch, he abruptly turned to me and whispered, "You look different today. I'm not sure what it is." I shrugged it off, thinking it was just his way of taunting me, but something about his tone made my skin tingle. "I am still the same person," I responded, hoping to keep the topic light. But he refused to let it go. "No, you are not. You have changed." He drew in closer, his gaze fixed on mine in a manner that made my pulse accelerate. I got up quickly, breaking the tension. "I'm going to bed." I grumbled and turned away before he could say anything more. But when I entered the home, I couldn't ignore the sensation that something was developing between us, something I wasn't prepared to confront. The following morning, everything looked to be back to normal. We returned to our routine, but the anxiety persisted. It was like a darkness looming over us, becoming darker. My nephew's stares got more frequent as the days passed. His touch is more casual, yet nevertheless too personal. I told myself I was only dreaming things, that everything was in my imagination. But deep down, I knew I wasn't. Then came a day that altered everything. It was a sweltering day, and the air seemed thick and heavy. We'd spent hours working in the barn, and I was fatigued, with my muscles throbbing from the strain. My nephew proposed that we take a break, and I agreed. Thankful for the relief, we sat in the shade, drinking cool beverages in quiet. Comfortable at first, but then out of nowhere, he asked me a question that stopped my heart. "Do you ever think about us? Think about us." I blinked, uncertain what he meant. "What do you mean?" I inquired, attempting to keep my voice calm. He did not respond straight away. Instead, he gazed at me for a long time, his gaze dark and intense. When he finally spoke, it was hardly audible. "You and I aren't that different. We're more similar than you realize." I wasn't sure what to say. The words lingered in the air between us, full with significance. I wanted to laugh and tell him how foolish he was being, but something in his eyes stopped me, and I knew it wasn't all in my brain. This was genuine. Something was going between us which I couldn't ignore any longer. I sprang up abruptly, my heart beating in my chest. I need to go." I stuttered and backed away from him, but my nephew did not move. He simply sat there, staring at me with that focused stare that suggested he knew something. I didn't, as if he expected me to figure it out. I turned and dashed back to the house, my thoughts racing. I told myself I was overreacting and hallucinating things. But deep inside, I understood the truth. Something had shifted between us. and I wasn't sure how to stop it. The narrative does not stop there. Far from it. In truth, this was just the beginning. What occurred next would rock me to my core, forcing me to confront sentiments I hadn't prepared to face. But there was more, much more, and I'd soon understand that the line between right and wrong had never been as clear as I believed. The days that followed were tight, charged with an intensity. I tried to appear as if in reality it wasn't simply if you said to me that it was the way if he was waiting to realize what was going on between us. I did not want to admit it. I wanted to pretend everything was normal, that we were simply family and nothing else. However, feigning became more difficult as time passed. I got up early the following morning, trying to avoid unpleasant talks. I felt I could keep myself occupied enough. I wouldn't have to remember how he stared at me the day before, or how my pulse beat. In response, the barn required cleaning, and the animals needed to be cared for. There was always something to do at the farm. I pushed myself into the duties with zeal, hoping to lose myself in the flow of labor. But he found me. Of course he always did. It was approximately noon, the sun high in the sky and the heat coming down on the fields, and as I saw him approaching, my heart raced. Something I despised. I despised how I was responding, like if my body was betraying me. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there and watched me rake the hay into nice heaps. I kept my eyes on the ground, focused on the work at hand, and refused to recognize his presence. But then he stated in a quiet and casual tone, "You've been avoiding me." I hesitated, my hands grasping the rake somewhat tighter. "I have not been avoiding you." I lied, well aware that this was precisely what I had been doing. He argued that since that day, "You've been changed." I turned to face him, and my heart thudded in my chest. "Nothing is different." I replied fast. He turned his head too swiftly, his eyes narrowing as if he could see straight through me. "That is untrue, and you are aware of it." His comments lingered in the air between us, heavy with a fact I did not want to face. I didn't know what to say or how to reply to his intense look. Part of me wanted to flee and put as much space between us as possible. But another part of me, one I wasn't proud of, wanted to remain. I dropped the rake, my hands trembling slightly as I took a step back. "I'm not sure what you're talking about." I said something, even though we both knew it wasn't true, but he refused to back down. He took another step forward, his gaze never leaving mine. "You know, you felt it too. That day, something shifted between us. And I know you're afraid to say it, but it's true. I can feel it." I opened my lips to argue, telling him he was mistaken and that nothing had changed. But the words wouldn't come, because he was correct. I had sensed it, and it scared me. "I can't do it." I pulled away from him and muttered, shaking my head, "You're my nephew. This isn't correct." He did not flinch. Instead, he moved closer, narrowing the gap between us. "I'm not a kid anymore," he replied gently, just above a whisper. "You can't keep treating me the way I am." You know, my heart was racing in my chest just now. A combination of terror and something else I didn't want to describe. I couldn't refute the veracity of his statements. He was no longer a youngster. He was a man now, and that fact terrified me the most. "I am not sure what you want from me." I spoke in a shaky voice. "But this cannot happen." But somewhere within me, I felt a sense of thrill that I couldn't quite pinpoint. He stretched out, his palm brushing over my arm, and I jerked in response. It was a simple touch, nothing overtly personal, yet it sent a shock through me. I took a step back, my breath stopping in my throat. He said that we are not obligated to do whatever you do not want to do. His voice is calm now, even comforting, yet there as something between us that cannot be denied. "You feel it exactly as I do." I shook my head, tears burning at the corners of my eyes. "It does not matter how I feel," I said. My voice is hardly heard. "This is incorrect." "Why is it wrong?" he inquired in a genuinely puzzled tone, as if he didn't realize the gravity of what he was saying. "We're both adults. Nobody else is here. No one else needs to know." His words shot shivers down my spine. Nobody else needs to know how simple it is. He made it seem simple and harmless, but it wasn't. It was everything but. "I cannot," I mumbled, backing away from him, my hands trembling. I attempted to recover control of my beating heart. "I need to go." But before I could react, he was there, his fingers softly grabbing my wrist and bringing me back into him. "Please do not go," he murmured softly and pleaded. "We can discuss this." "Don't run away." I wasn't sure what to do. Part of me wanted to run away from the intensity of the situation, but another part of me, one I refused to believe existed, wanted to remain. I could sense the tension between us, which had been growing since my arrival. It was like a hurricane gaining power with each passing instant, and I was trapped in the eye of it. He freed my wrist but did not step away. Instead, he stood there and watched me. I could sense the weight of his stare, the unsaid promise of anything more, and for the first time, I wasn't sure I could resist it. His eyes softened, and I detected something unexpected in them: vulnerability. "I understand that this is perplexing," he spoke in a scarcely audible voice, "but I've never felt this strongly about someone before." His remarks struck me harder than anticipated. There was truth in his voice, a raw honesty that I couldn't shake, and I understood for the first time that this wasn't simply a passing fancy. For him, this was something deeper, more genuine, but that didn't make it right. I took a long breath, trying to compose myself and gather the fortitude to do what I knew I had to do. "I need some room." I spoke in a scarcely audible voice. I assume he nodded, but I could see disappointment in his eyes. He added quietly, "Take as much time as you need, but please do not lock me out." I did not react. I could not. Instead, I turned and went away, my heart heavy from what had transpired. My thoughts raced as I made my way back to the home. Something had changed between us, which I couldn't ignore, but I wasn't sure I was strong enough to reject it. I could not sleep that night. The farmhouse's quiet was oppressive, bearing down on me as I lay in bed, looking up at the black ceiling. Every creak of the floorboards, every distant animal sound from the barn simply added to the tumult in my mind. I kept rehearsing our chat with my nephew, his words reverberating in my head over and again. "You cannot deny that there is something between us." The worst thing was, he was correct. I could not refute it. I had felt the same pull, this odd connection, but I was too afraid to confess it. It wasn't intended to be this way, not between us, but something inside of me had changed, and I couldn't go back to pretending. Nothing had changed. Morning arrived, but I was no closer to obtaining any answers. I awoke early, aiming to put some space between us. Maybe if I ignored him and concentrated on the farm work, I could put these ideas at bay. But deep down, I knew I couldn't ignore him indefinitely. He was unrelenting and persistent, making it hard to ignore him. By lunchtime, the heat was terrible. I found myself out in the fields, trying to occupy myself with the crops, but my thoughts kept returning to him. It seemed as if he was constantly around, lurking on the borders of my thoughts, until I heard him approach. "Hey!" He shouted out from behind me, his tone low and nonchalant, as if nothing had transpired between us. But I realized that nothing was the same now. I carefully turned around, preparing myself for the unavoidable tension that seemed to rise whenever we were alone. He was just a few steps away, looking at me with those same focused eyes. But this time, his look was milder, which made my heart accelerate. In a sense, I was unprepared. "I thought we could chat," he said, moving a step closer to everything. I paused, my pulse racing in my chest. I replied, "I don't think there's anything to talk about." Even as I said, the words seemed empty. Of course there was something to discuss. Everything had changed, and we knew it. He shook his head, and his gaze never left mine. "That is not true. We can't keep pretending that nothing is occurring. You feel it as well, don't you?" My throat clenched. I wanted to deny it, push him away, and put a stop to this for good. But it was too much for me to resist when he was standing so close to me, staring at me with such naked honesty. The tension between us had been building for far too long, and it seemed like it was about to snap. I don't know what to say. I stuttered and took a step back, but he merely moved closer, narrowing the gap between us. "You don't need to say anything," he said in a deep and personal tone, sending shivers down my spine. "Just listen." And before I could respond, he leaned in. I stopped, my breath stopping in my throat as his face approached, his lips only inches away from mine. I should have pulled away. I should have stopped him, but I did not. Instead, I stood there, my pulse beating as the world appeared to pause around us. His eyes focused on mine, and for a short minute, it seemed as if we were the only two people in the world. Then his lips contacted mine. It was gentle at first, just a whisper of a kiss. Yet it was enough to set my thoughts racing. I hadn't anticipated it, hadn't allowed myself to believe it would come to this. But it was happening. I could not seem to stop it. His lips pushed forcefully on mine, and I felt a flood of heat flow through me, overpowering and perplexing all at the same time. For a brief period, I returned his kiss. It was an innate response that I had no control over, but it was enough to fracture the frail barricade I'd erected around myself throughout that breakup. Second, everything I had been attempting to suppress surfaced, including the tension, desire, and unmistakable connection we had been avoiding for days. It was everything there, naked. Our lips connected for a short time before disappearing as swiftly as they had appeared. I drew away. I staggered back, my pulse thumping in my chest and my mind whirling with 1,000 things that I couldn't understand. "Eno," I mumbled, shaking my head as if I could remove what had just occurred. "This isn't correct." He glanced at me with an enigmatic face, but there was no mistaking the intensity in his eyes. "You can't say you didn't feel it," he murmured gently. "I know you did." I drew a trembling breath, attempting to stabilize myself. "It does not matter how I felt. This cannot happen. It will not happen." "But why?" he said softly but insistently. "Why does it have to be wrong? We are not endangering anybody." I couldn't believe what he was saying. I couldn't believe we were really having this talk. It seemed like the earth was sliding out from beneath me, and nothing made sense anymore. "We are family," I murmured, my voice quivering. "You are my nephew, and this is wrong." He shook his head and his countenance hardened. "We aren't like that, honestly." His words shot shivers down my spine. He was so confident in himself that everything we were doing was somehow justified. But I knew better. I needed to know better. This could not happen. I couldn't allow it. "I cannot." I shouted it again, more forcefully. "This time I won't." For a long time he said nothing. He simply stood there, looking at me with that same intense stare. I could see the anguish in his eyes. But then he gently nodded. "Okay," he said softly. "If that's what you want." It wasn't what I wanted. Not at all. But it was what needed to happen. I looked away, my heart heavy in my chest. I didn't glance back and didn't dare to. I couldn't take the chance of witnessing the sorrow in his eyes, or worse. The desire matched mine own. When I returned to the farmhouse, I went directly to my room, slamming the door behind me and resting against it as if I could keep everything out. Unfortunately, it was too late. The harm had been done. The line between us had been crossed, and there was no turning back, no matter how hard I tried to persuade myself. However, it was far from the end. What began as a simple kiss had set off a chain reaction that I couldn't stop, even if I tried. The tension between us had not subsided. It had only gotten stronger and more deadly, and it would soon come tumbling down around us in ways I had not anticipated, since the kiss was merely the start. The days that followed were awful. That quick kiss tore through me like a wildfire. I couldn't get over the sensation of his lips on mine, the intensity in his gaze, and the unsaid promise that had remained between us. It tormented me. It overwhelmed me. It had been a mistake. I knew this, but it didn't make it any easier to forget. The worst part was, when we met, he didn't seem to be in as much pain as I was. His gaze followed me, calm and steady, as if he was waiting for anything to shatter me, but I refused to give in. By the end of this week, I was fatigued, both mentally and physically. The restless nights and long days had taken their toll, yet no amount of effort could undo what had occurred between us. I was always on edge, second-guessing myself, wondering whether I should have done things differently, but there was no way to return it now. One evening after an especially exhausting day in the fields, I returned to the farmhouse to find him sitting on the porch, waiting for me. My heart plummeted upon seeing him. I wasn't prepared for another confrontation, especially after all that had transpired. I simply wanted to leave, to find an escape from the tension that had been growing between us, like a storm on the horizon. He didn't say anything as I passed by him, his gaze tracking my every movement. I could feel the weight of his stare and the unanswered questions lingering between us, but I kept my head down. I was determined not to participate. I couldn't trust myself to speak to him just now. While I was still reeling from the kiss and trying to make sense of my own emotions, I grabbed for the door, brushing against the handle, when his voice cut me off. "We are doing this right now." His tone was not inquiring, but ordering. My heartbeat quickened as I slowly turned. As I met his gaze, there was no more uncertainty or control. He stood a few paces back, the expression in his eyes, dark and determined. I did not respond since there was no use in denying it. His energy filled the space between us, pushing down on me. As he closed the gap, his gaze shifted to the door and then back to me, taunting me to attempt to escape. But I was not moving. Not anymore. "We are done waiting," he mumbled quietly, full of determination. I stood there, my breath unsteady, and my body pushed tightly against his. As his fingers tightened around me, the space became narrower. Now there is no room between us. His kiss awoke something deep inside me, a need I had been suppressing for so long that it now devoured every thought. He acted without hesitation. Without a doubt, all we needed was the desire to grab what had been growing between us. His hands moved from my waist to the small of my back, his fingers hard, drawing me in closer. My hands clutched his shirt, fingers curling into the cloth as his lips pressed harder on mine. This time, he kissed me with a desire that equaled my own. There was no way out, nor did I want one. The heat between us was oppressive, but I embraced it. I could feel the warmth of his breath on my skin, followed by a light touch from his lips. Then his tongue heated up. "We will not stop," he muttered against my skin, his voice low and gravelly, full of assurance. "I know," I muttered, my voice barely audible, my thoughts racing from the stress of the situation. There was no going back, no space for second thoughts. I did not want to quit. I wanted more. "You're gorgeous," he muttered in a gruff voice full of yearning. There was no uncertainty in his remarks, no ambiguity in the way he stared at me. He wanted me complete. "So tell me what you," he murmured softly, his breath hot. "I desire you," I responded with a whisper. My voice shook with longing. "I want all of you." That's all he needed to hear. In a second, he was moving again, his hands rapidly slipping down my pants and legs, leaving me nude underneath him. His gaze swept over me, filled with a passion that made my pulse beat even faster. But that short sensation of calm vanished in an instant. The sound of tires crunching on dirt rang through the silent night, and the distant growl of an engine brought everything tumbling down. I felt him strain above me, his body hardening as reality broke through our carefully crafted cocoon. "They're back," he muttered, his voice tense and frustrated. The significance of his parents' comments struck me like a blow in the belly. Suddenly, the weight of the situation fell on me. We had been so captivated by our own needs and the intensity of the moment that we had forgotten about everything else, about the implications, about the people who wouldn't or couldn't comprehend. He sat up abruptly, moving away from me, and I felt frigid air rush in to fill the void he left. His actions were frenetic, in sharp contrast to the patient, careful manner he had handled me only minutes before. He snatched his shirt from the floor and yanked it over his head in a single move, his eyes black with terror and wrath. I raced to sit up as well, wrapping the blanket about me to collect my thoughts. But my mind was racing. The sound of the vehicle door slamming outside rang through the walls, causing my heart to accelerate once again, but this time out of terror rather than want. What were our thoughts? What did we have? Just finished? His attention shifted to the window, the fury evident in the way his jaw tightened and his hands balled at his sides. We were not intended to be caught like this. He grumbled more to himself than at me. "They do not know," I said, not knowing whether I was reassuring him or myself. "We can hide it." He cut me off, his voice as harsh as I'd ever heard it. His displeasure was tangible, and it was now flowing out in waves. "How long do you think we can keep this hidden?" I opened my lips to react, but I didn't know what to say. I hadn't considered this far ahead. We had been too caught up in the moment with each other to consider what would happen next, and it was now too late. There was a knock on the door below, followed by his mother's voice shouting his name. Her pleasant and innocent tone twisted something deep inside me. This was his home, family, and existence, and I was an invader threatening to ruin all he had. His gaze shifted to the door, then back to me. For a split second, I could see the tension in his countenance, the fight between what he desired and what he knew to be right. And then, almost as abruptly, his expression tightened. "We will chat later," he remarked in a clipped voice, burying the passion under the surface. He stood tugging on his pants, his actions fast and almost furious. I watched him. My chest tightened with remorse and anxiety. I had never seen him so closed off and distant. I wanted to say anything to reach out and stop him, but the words did not come. He ran his fingers through his hair. His motions are sharp, indicating frustration. He murmured without meeting my gaze, "I'll handle them," and then he was gone, the door closing behind him, leaving me alone in the frigid quiet of the room. I sat there for a time, the weight of everything slamming down on me, my heart pounding in my chest, my mind spinning with 1,000 ideas I couldn't sort out. I knew this wasn't going to end well, but I didn't expect it to come apart so fast. Downstairs I could hear muffled voices, his parents inquiring how he had spent his evening, his father's powerful voice booming through the house, his mother's laughing following, and then his voice firm calm, as if nothing had happened, as if we hadn't just crossed a line that could never be undone. The minutes seemed like hours as I sat there waiting for the other shoe to drop, for everything to come tumbling down. I wondered what he was saying them, whether he was already setting the basis for a lie, or if he was just trying to be normal, hoping they wouldn't notice the tension in the air. I heard footsteps ascending the stairs, and my breath seized in my throat. The door creaked open, and he walked back inside. His look is unreadable. "They're going to bed," he replied gently, his voice empty of the passion it had contained before he closed the door behind him, resting against it for a second before meeting my gaze. The tension in the air was thick and heavy as we gazed at one another, the weight of what had just transpired settling between us. Then we resumed our previous activities. It was just great. We were occupied for what seemed like minutes, but after we'd done, I checked my watch, and it had already been 2 hours. I hadn't felt this way in years until he did something unexpected. "This was a mistake," he said gently, his voice straining. My heart dropped at his words, as shame washed over me like a wave. But before I could reply, he shook his head and ran his hand through his hair again. "Not you," he added hastily, lowering his tone, concealing it and creeping around. "I'm not sure how we're going to accomplish this." I swallowed hard, uncertain of what to say. The truth of the situation was slamming in on both of us, and neither of us had any solutions. But one thing was clear: everything had just become immensely more difficult. He slowly turned away, and I stayed in the stillness, aware that everything had moved. What was once obvious now seemed fragile, trapped in the hush of what couldn't be undone. The moment was gone, but its shadow remained, creating a subtle unease that none of us could shake.